Sensitive content warning. This video contains discussions about slavery, sexual abuse, and institutional violence. It may not be suitable for all audiences. What happens when the truth you've been avoiding stares back at you through the innocent eyes of children? When Mrs. Evelyn Ashford walked into that room on a humid Georgia morning, she had no idea that a simple question would unravel decades of buried secrets and force her to confront the darkest corners of her family's legacy. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, truth, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because this journey will leave you questioning what you would do in her place. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Plantation's main house, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Mrs. Evelyn Ashford, dressed in her finest blue silk dress, walked purposefully through the corridors she had called home for the past 15 years. The house, with its grand columns and sprawling verandas, had always been a symbol of Southern prosperity and tradition, a legacy her husband James had inherited from his grandfather. But today something felt different. Evelyn had returned from her month-long visit to her sister in Charleston the previous evening, and James was still away on business in Atlanta, a trip that had stretched from 2 weeks to nearly 2 months. The house felt eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of children playing somewhere in the servants' quarters. The plantation itself sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of prime Georgia farmland, with tobacco fields stretching as far as the eye could see and cotton growing in the lower fields near the river. It was a testament to generations of Ashford prosperity, built on the backs of over 200 enslaved people who worked from dawn to dusk to maintain the family's wealth and status. Evelyn had always prided herself on being a more enlightened mistress than some of her neighbors. She ensured the workers had adequate food and medical care. She didn't permit the use of whips for minor infractions, and she had even quietly arranged for some of the children to learn basic reading skills, though such education was technically illegal. She believed these small kindnesses made her different, better than the cruel plantation owners she had heard whispered about in Charleston society. As she made her way toward the kitchen to discuss the day's meals with Martha, the head cook, Evelyn heard the unmistakable sound of children's laughter echoing from the small room adjacent to the kitchen, a space typically used for the workers' children during the day while their parents attended to their duties. The sound was pure and joyful, the kind of innocent merriment that always made her smile. She and James had been trying for children for years without success, and the sound of young voices always stirred something deep and painful within her. Perhaps that was why she felt drawn to investigate, to catch a glimpse of the happiness that had eluded her own life. Curiosity getting the better of her, Evelyn gently pushed open the door and stepped inside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 7 children, ranging in age from about 4 to 12, sat in a circle on the wooden floor, playing with simple wooden toys and corn-husk dolls. But it wasn't their innocent play that stopped Evelyn cold. It was their faces. Every single child bore an unmistakable resemblance to Samuel, the quiet, disciplined man who had worked the plantation for as long as she could remember. The same deep-set brown eyes, the same strong jawline, the same gentle curve of the lips. The similarities were so striking that for a moment Evelyn wondered if she was seeing things. The children's skin tones varied, some lighter, some darker, suggesting different mothers, but the facial features were unmistakably consistent. It was as if someone had taken Samuel's face and created 7 different variations of it, each beautiful in its own way, but all clearly sharing the same paternal heritage. "Good morning, children," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The children looked up, their play stopping abruptly. Their eyes, Samuel's eyes, met hers with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. Fear, resignation. There was an awareness in their gazes that seemed far too mature for their young faces, as if they had learned early in life to be cautious around adults, especially white adults. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," they chorused in unison, their voices small and respectful. The oldest girl, who appeared to be about 12, immediately began gathering the toys, her movements quick and efficient. The younger children followed her lead, their play forgotten as they prepared to make themselves invisible, a skill that seemed as natural to them as breathing. Martha appeared in the doorway behind her, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, Miss Evelyn, I didn't know you were back here. These young ones were just—" "Martha," Evelyn interrupted, her eyes never leaving the children's faces. "Why do all these children look so much alike?" The silence that followed was deafening. Martha's hands stilled on her apron, and the children seemed to shrink into themselves, their gazes dropping to the floor. The oldest girl's hand found the smallest boy's shoulder, a protective gesture that spoke of responsibility far beyond her years. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Evelyn," Martha stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Evelyn turned to face the older woman, studying her expression. Martha had been with the Ashford family for over 20 years, arriving as a young woman shortly after Evelyn's own marriage to James. In all that time, Evelyn had never seen her look so uncomfortable, so genuinely frightened. "Martha, please, I'm not blind. These children, they all have the same features, the same eyes, the same—" She paused, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. They all look like Samuel. The admission hung in the air like a storm cloud. Martha's face went pale, and she glanced nervously toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. The children remained frozen in their positions, their small bodies tense with an anxiety that no child should have to carry. "Miss Evelyn, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," Martha whispered urgently. But Evelyn wasn't ready to leave. She knelt down to the children's level, her silk dress pooling around her on the rough wooden floor. Up close, she could see even more clearly the family resemblance that connected them all, not just to Samuel but to each other. They were siblings, or at least half-siblings, bound together by blood and circumstance. "What are your names?" she asked gently. The oldest child, a girl with Samuel's intelligent eyes and what appeared to be mixed heritage, spoke first. "I'm Sarah, Mum. This is my brother Thomas, and that's Mary and Jacob and—" "Sarah," Martha interrupted sharply, "why don't you children go outside and play? Miss Evelyn and I need to talk." The children scrambled to their feet, gathering their simple toys with practiced efficiency. As they filed past Evelyn toward the door, she noticed how they moved, with the same quiet dignity she had always observed in Samuel, the same careful way of taking up as little space as possible. They had learned to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention to themselves, and the skill was both heartbreaking and telling. When the last child had left, Martha closed the door and turned to face Evelyn, her expression a mixture of resignation and fear. "Miss Evelyn, there are some things, some family matters that perhaps Mr. James should discuss with you when he returns. James has been gone for 2 months, Martha, and before that, he was away more often than he was home." Evelyn stood, brushing dust from her dress. "I'm asking you directly, are those children Samuel's?" Martha's silence was answer enough. "How many?" Evelyn's voice was barely audible. "7 that I know of, ma'am, maybe more." The room seemed to spin around Evelyn. She reached out to steady herself against the wall, her mind racing. 7 children, all bearing Samuel's unmistakable features. All living here on the plantation, in the shadows of the main house, their existence acknowledged by everyone except the one person who should have known about them. "And their mothers?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Different women, Miss Evelyn. Some who used to work here, some who didn't have a choice in the matter." The implication hit Evelyn like a sledgehammer. She had always prided herself on running a more humane household than some of their neighbors, treating the workers with respect and ensuring they had adequate food and shelter. But this suggested something far darker had been happening under her own roof, something that made a mockery of all her small kindnesses and progressive attitudes. "Samuel," she whispered, "is he—" "Samuel is a good man, Miss Evelyn," Martha said quickly, her voice fierce with protective loyalty. "He's never hurt anyone, never raised his voice, never caused trouble. He works harder than any 2 men, and he's gentle with those children like they were made of glass." "Then how—" Martha looked away, unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. "It wasn't Samuel's doing, ma'am. Samuel. He's not the one with the power in this house." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Evelyn felt the world she thought she knew crumbling around her. Her husband's family, the Ashford legacy, the plantation she had called home for 15 years. Suddenly it all felt foreign and threatening. "I need to speak with Samuel," Evelyn said finally. "Miss Evelyn, I don't think that's wise. If Mr. James were to find out—" "James isn't here," Evelyn said firmly, "and I am the mistress of this house. I want to speak with Samuel, now." Martha nodded reluctantly. "He's working in the tobacco fields today, but Miss Evelyn, please, be careful. There are some truths that can't be taken back once they're spoken." As Evelyn walked toward the door, her mind was already racing ahead to the conversation she was about to have. She had always noticed Samuel. It was impossible not to. He was a man of quiet dignity in his mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and a way of moving that suggested strength held carefully in check. She had often wondered about his story, about how he had come to work at Ashford Plantation, but she had never asked. In the South of 1847, there were questions that proper ladies simply didn't ask. But today she was going to ask them all. The heat hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, the Georgia sun already intense despite the early hour. She could see the workers in the distant tobacco fields, their figures small against the vast expanse of green. Somewhere among them was Samuel, and with him, the answers to questions she was only beginning to formulate. As she walked toward the fields, Evelyn couldn't shake the image of those 7 children from her mind. Their faces, so innocent, yet marked by a sadness that no child should carry. Their careful movements as if they had learned early in life to make themselves invisible. And most disturbing of all, the way they had looked at her, not with the simple respect she was accustomed to from the plantation's children, but with a wariness that suggested they knew exactly who she was and what her presence in their lives might mean. And Samuel's eyes, looking back at her from 7 different faces, telling a story that no one had ever dared to speak aloud. The tobacco fields stretched endlessly under the merciless Georgia sun, the broad leaves creating a sea of green that shimmered in the heat. Evelyn had never ventured this far into the working areas of the plantation alone, and she felt the weight of curious stares as she made her way down the dirt path between the rows. The workers, men and women bent over their tasks, looked up as she passed, their expressions carefully neutral. Some nodded respectfully, others simply watched, but all seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. The mistress of the house didn't typically walk the fields in her finest dress, her face set with grim determination. The air was thick with the sweet, earthy smell of tobacco, and the sound of insects buzzing in the humid heat. Sweat began to bead on Evelyn's forehead despite the early hour, and she could feel her dress beginning to stick to her skin. The workers, she noticed, moved with an economy of motion born of long experience, their bodies adapted to the brutal demands of field labor under the southern sun. As she walked deeper into the fields, Evelyn began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way the workers' clothes were patched and repatched, held together by careful stitching and determination. The way they carried themselves, back straight despite the back-breaking labor, dignity maintained even in the face of dehumanizing conditions. The way they looked at her, not with hatred as she might have expected, but with a complex mixture of wariness, curiosity, and something that might have been hope. She found Samuel near the far edge of the field, working alone to repair a section of irrigation channel that had been damaged by the previous week's heavy rains. He was stripped to the waist in the heat, his dark skin glistening with sweat as he carefully fitted stones into place. His movements were methodical, precise, the work of a man who took pride in doing things right, even when no one was watching. The muscles in his back and shoulders spoke of years of hard labor, but there was something else in his posture, a dignity that couldn't be broken, a sense of self that had survived whatever trials had brought him to this place. Evelyn found herself wondering about his life before Ashford Plantation, about the family he might have left behind, about the dreams that had been deferred or destroyed by his enslavement. "Samuel," she called softly. He looked up, and for a moment she saw surprise flicker across his features before he quickly composed himself. He reached for his shirt, pulling it on as he straightened to face her. Even in that simple gesture, she could see the careful respect that had been beaten into him over the years, the automatic deference that was expected of enslaved people when confronted by their owners. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice deep and respectful. "Is there something you need, ma'am?" Up close, the resemblance to the children was even more striking, the same gentle intelligence in his eyes, the same strong bone structure. But there was something else there too, a wariness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about the dangers of drawing attention, of speaking too freely, of trusting too easily. "I need to ask you some questions, Samuel, about the children." His entire body went still. For a long moment they stood facing each other in the blazing sun, the only sounds the distant voices of other workers and the buzz of insects in the tobacco leaves. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the careful weighing of risks and possibilities that had become second nature to him. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think you do." Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I saw them this morning, Samuel. 7 children, all with your eyes, your face. I need to understand what's been happening here." Samuel's jaw tightened, and she saw his hands clench briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, each word measured and deliberate. "Miss Evelyn, with respect, there are some conversations that could be dangerous for both of us. More dangerous than the truth remaining buried." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if trying to gauge whether she could handle what she was asking to hear. What he saw in her expression seemed to convince him because his shoulders sagged slightly, as if he were setting down a burden he had carried for too long. "Not here," he said quietly. "Too many ears, too many eyes. If you truly want to know, meet me at the old mill after sunset. But Miss Evelyn—" He paused, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it, and it will change everything." The warning sent a chill down her spine despite the oppressive heat. She nodded slowly, understanding that she was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and growing dread. Evelyn tried to maintain her normal routine, reviewing household accounts, discussing menu plans with Martha, writing letters to friends in Charleston, but her mind kept returning to Samuel's words and the promise of revelations to come. She found herself watching the plantation with new eyes, noticing things that had always been there, but that she had somehow managed not to see. The way certain workers avoided eye contact when James was around, the way conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the way the children she had met that morning seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts, always present but never acknowledged. During the afternoon, she made an excuse to visit the workers' quarters, ostensibly to check on an elderly woman who had been ill. As she walked through the small community of cabins, she was struck by how different it felt from the main house. Here, despite the poverty and overcrowding, there was a sense of genuine community, families caring for each other, children playing together, adults sharing the burdens of their difficult lives. She saw Sarah, the oldest of Samuel's children, helping to tend to younger children who weren't her siblings. The girl moved with a maturity beyond her years, clearly serving as a caretaker and protector for the younger ones. When she noticed Evelyn watching, Sarah's expression became carefully neutral, but not before Evelyn caught a glimpse of the intelligence and strength that lay beneath the surface. As evening approached, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out over the plantation grounds. From this vantage point, she could see the small cabins where the workers lived, smoke rising from their chimneys as families gathered for their evening meals. Somewhere among those humble dwellings were the 7 children she had met that morning, and somewhere was the truth about how they came to be. The old mill sat beside a creek about half a mile from the main house, its wooden wheel long since fallen into disrepair. It had been abandoned for years, used now only for storage and the occasional clandestine meeting between young couples. As Evelyn made her way there in the gathering dusk, she felt like she was walking toward a precipice from which there would be no return. The path to the mill wound through a grove of ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss, their branches creating a natural cathedral in the fading light. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and she found herself jumping at every rustle in the underbrush, every call of a night bird settling in for the evening. Samuel was already waiting when she arrived, sitting on a fallen log near the creek's edge. He had changed into clean clothes and looked somehow smaller in the fading light, less imposing than he had in the fields. But his eyes, when they met hers, held the same quiet strength she had always noticed. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would." Evelyn settled herself on a nearby stump, her dress carefully arranged around her. "Now, please, tell me the truth." Samuel was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he had changed his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile trust that had brought them to this moment. "Those children, they are mine. But not by choice, Miss Evelyn, never by choice." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she had suspected as much. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for the past 12 years, since I was brought to this plantation, I have been used by your husband's father first, and then by your husband himself. Not for field work, not for housework, but for—" He stopped, unable to continue. Evelyn felt sick. "Samuel, I don't understand. You're a man, you're strong. How could they force me?" His laugh was bitter. "Miss Evelyn, I may be strong, but I'm also a slave. Do you know what happens to a slave who refuses his master's orders? Do you know what happens to his family, his friends, anyone he cares about?" The reality of his situation began to dawn on her. Samuel wasn't just a worker on the plantation. He was property. Property that could be bought, sold, punished, or destroyed at his owner's whim. And with that understanding came the horrifying realization of how completely powerless he had been to protect himself or the women who had been forced to bear his children. "The women," she whispered, "the mothers of those children." "Some were willing," Samuel said quietly. "Some found comfort in gentleness after experiencing the alternative. Others were forced to come to me, told that if they didn't, worse things would happen to them or their families. And some," his voice broke slightly, "some were just children themselves when it started." Evelyn buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. The plantation she had called home, the family she had married into, the life she had built, all of it was founded on a system of abuse and exploitation that she had been blind to. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked through her tears. "Tell you what, Miss Evelyn, that your husband's family has been using me as a breeding stud for over a decade. That those beautiful children you saw today are the products of a system designed to create more slaves for the plantation. What good would that knowledge have done you? I could have stopped it. Could you?" Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "You're a woman in 1847, Miss Evelyn. You have no legal rights to this property, no authority over your husband's decisions. And even if you did, what then? Where would I go? Where would those children go? This plantation is the only home they've ever known." The truth of his words was devastating. Even if she had known, even if she had wanted to help, the legal and social constraints of their world would have made it nearly impossible. "The children," she said finally. "Do they know?" "They know they're different. They know they're not supposed to ask questions about their fathers. They know to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay out of the way when certain people are around." Samuel's voice was heavy with pain. "They're good children, Miss Evelyn. Smart, kind, loving. They deserve better than this. And you? What do you deserve?" Samuel looked at her with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him. "I deserve what any man deserves, I suppose. The right to choose who I love, who I'm with. The right to protect my children, to raise them, to give them my name. The right to be seen as a human being instead of—" He gestured helplessly. "Instead of this." They sat in silence as full darkness fell around them, the creek babbling softly beside them and fireflies beginning to dance in the warm air. Evelyn's mind was reeling with everything she had learned, trying to process the implications of Samuel's revelations. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you go back to your life, and I go back to mine. Nothing changes, Miss Evelyn, nothing can change. But James is still away. He might be gone for weeks more. And when he comes back, things will return to the way they've always been. Unless—" Samuel hesitated, then looked at her directly. "Unless you're planning to tell him about this conversation." The question hung between them, loaded with danger. If Evelyn told James what she had learned, Samuel's life would be forfeit. But if she remained silent, she would become complicit in the very system she now found abhorrent. "I don't know," she admitted. "I honestly don't know what I'm going to do." Samuel nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then I suppose we'll both have to wait and see what kind of woman you really are, Miss Evelyn." As they parted ways in the darkness, Evelyn walking back toward the main house and Samuel disappearing into the shadows toward the workers' quarters, she carried with her the weight of knowledge that would forever change how she saw her world. Behind her, the old mill stood silent and abandoned, keeper of secrets that had the power to destroy everything she had ever believed about her life, her marriage and herself. 3 weeks had passed since Evelyn's conversation with Samuel at the old mill, and the knowledge she carried felt like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with each passing day. She found herself watching the plantation with new eyes, seeing the careful way the workers moved around certain areas, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the way the 7 children seemed to materialize and disappear like ghosts. Sleep had become elusive, her nights filled with restless pacing and tormented thoughts. She would stand at her bedroom window for hours, staring out at the workers' quarters, wondering about the lives being lived in those small cabins, the stories of pain and resilience that she had been blind to for so long. The weight of her ignorance, willful or otherwise, pressed down on her like a physical burden. During the day, she found herself making excuses to visit different parts of the plantation, observing interactions she had never paid attention to before. She saw how certain workers flinched when approached by the white overseers, how mothers pulled their children closer when unfamiliar white men appeared, how conversations died abruptly when she entered a room. The plantation that had once seemed like a well-ordered community now revealed itself as a carefully maintained facade, hiding a world of fear and oppression. James had sent word that his business in Atlanta was concluding, and he would return within the week. The prospect of facing her husband with what she now knew filled Evelyn with a mixture of dread and determination that kept her awake most nights, pacing the floors of the main house like a caged animal. She had begun making subtle inquiries about the Underground Railroad, carefully probing conversations with visitors from Charleston and Savannah for any hints about escape routes or sympathetic contacts. The information was dangerous to seek, and even more dangerous to possess, but she felt compelled to explore every possible option for helping Samuel and his children. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she heard the commotion. Raised voices carried across the plantation grounds, coming from the direction of the workers' quarters. Evelyn rushed to her bedroom window and peered out into the darkness, her heart racing. She could see the flickering light of torches and the silhouettes of several men moving between the cabins. Without thinking, she threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried downstairs and out into the night. As she drew closer to the disturbance, she could make out the voices more clearly, and her blood ran cold when she recognized one of them. James had returned early. "Where is he?" James's voice cut through the night air, sharp with anger. "I know he's here somewhere." Evelyn crept closer, staying in the shadows of the oak trees that lined the path to the workers' quarters. She could see her husband now, standing in the center of the small community with 3 other white men she didn't recognize, rough-looking men with the bearing of slave catchers. Their presence here in the middle of the night could only mean trouble. The workers had emerged from their cabins, forming a protective circle around their families. Even in the flickering torchlight, Evelyn could see the fear in their faces, the way parents instinctively moved to shield their children from whatever violence might come. "Mr. James, sir," came Martha's voice, trembling with fear. "I don't know who you're looking for. Everyone's accounted for. Everyone's where they should be. Don't lie to me, Martha." James spun around to face the older woman, his face twisted with rage. "I received a very interesting letter while I was in Atlanta. Someone has been spreading stories about this plantation, about my family, stories that could ruin us if they reached the wrong ears." Evelyn's heart sank. Someone had talked. Someone had revealed the truth about Samuel and the children, and now James was here for revenge. She pressed herself closer to the tree trunk, trying to remain hidden while straining to hear every word. "What kind of stories, Mr. James?" Martha asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Stories about children who shouldn't exist. Stories about improper relationships between family members and slaves. Stories that paint my family as monsters." James's voice rose with each word, his anger building to a dangerous crescendo. "Samuel!" James called out, his voice echoing across the quarters. I know you're here. Come out now, and maybe I'll make this quick. A door opened slowly and Samuel emerged from one of the cabins. Even in the flickering torchlight, Evelyn could see the resignation in his posture, the way he held himself like a man walking to his execution. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of small faces peering out from the cabin's windows, his children, watching their father face whatever fate awaited him. "Mr. James," Samuel said quietly, "you wanted to see me." "Oh, I wanted to do more than see you." James stepped closer, and Evelyn could see the fury radiating from him. "Did you really think you could spread lies about my family and get away with it? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "I haven't told anyone anything, sir." "Liar!" James backhanded Samuel across the face, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Samuel staggered but didn't fall, didn't raise his hands to defend himself. The workers around them flinched at the violence, but no one moved to intervene. They all knew that interfering would only make things worse. "Someone in Charleston is asking questions about the children on this plantation," James continued, circling Samuel like a predator. Someone described them in very specific detail, someone who had clearly seen them up close. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Charleston. Her sister lived in Charleston. Had she said something during her visit? Had she mentioned the children without realizing the implications? The thought that her own careless words might have led to this confrontation filled her with guilt and terror. "I want to know who you've been talking to," James continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And I want to know what you told them." "I haven't told anyone anything," Samuel repeated, his voice steady despite the blood trickling from his split lip. "Then maybe you need some encouragement to remember." James nodded to one of the men he had brought with him. "String him up." The slave catcher moved forward with a length of rope, and Evelyn saw the workers around them tense with helpless rage. Several of the women began to weep quietly, while the men stood with clenched fists, knowing that any attempt to help Samuel would result in their own deaths. "No!" The word tore from Evelyn's throat before she could stop it. She stepped out of the shadows, her nightgown billowing around her as she hurried toward the group. James spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. "Evelyn, what the hell are you doing out here?" "I heard the noise," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I came to see what was happening. Go back to the house. This doesn't concern you." "It does if you're about to murder one of our workers." Evelyn stepped between James and Samuel, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. James's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Murder? Who said anything about murder? I'm simply disciplining a disobedient slave by stringing him up, if necessary." James grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Now go back to the house before you embarrass yourself further." "I'm not going anywhere." Evelyn pulled free from his grasp, surprising herself with her own strength. "And neither is Samuel." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the insects seemed to have stopped their nighttime chorus. James stared at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time, while the workers who had gathered to watch the confrontation held their collective breath. Around them, the night air was thick with tension and the smell of fear. Evelyn could see the faces of Samuel's children pressed against the cabin windows, their young eyes wide with terror as they watched their father's fate being decided. The sight of their frightened faces gave her the courage to stand her ground. "What did you say?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "I said Samuel isn't going anywhere. Not tonight, not ever." Evelyn's voice grew stronger with each word. "I know what you've been doing, James. I know about the children." James went very still. "What children?" "Samuel's children. The 7 children who live in the shadows of our house, who bear his face but can never claim his name. The children who exist because you and your father turned a human being into a breeding animal." The words hung in the air like an accusation from heaven itself. James's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, calculation, and finally, cold fury. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said finally. "Don't I?" Evelyn stepped closer to her husband, no longer caring about the consequences. "Sarah, Thomas, Mary, Jacob, shall I continue? They all have Samuel's eyes, James. They all have his gentle nature, and they all have the look of children who know they're not supposed to exist." James's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "You're hysterical, Evelyn." The heat, The isolation, it's affected your mind. My mind is perfectly clear. Evelyn's voice rang out across the quarters, carrying to every cabin, every hiding place. Clear enough to see that the man I married is a monster. Clear enough to know that I can't stand by and watch you destroy another innocent life. Innocent? James laughed, a harsh sound that made several of the watching workers flinch. He's a slave, Evelyn, property. He exists to serve the needs of this plantation, whatever those needs might be. He's a human being. He's a thing that I own. James's composure finally cracked, his voice rising to a roar. Just like this land, just like these cabins, just like you. Everything here belongs to me, and I'll do with it whatever I damn well please. The admission hung between them like a chasm. Evelyn saw clearly now what her marriage really was, what she really was in James's eyes. Not a partner, not a companion, but another piece of property to be managed and controlled. Then I suppose, she said quietly, it's time for your property to rebel. She turned to face the gathered workers, her voice carrying across the quarters with surprising strength. I am Evelyn Ashford, mistress of this plantation, and I am hereby declaring that Samuel is under my protection. Anyone who harms him will answer to me. The declaration was legally meaningless. She had no authority to free slaves or countermand her husband's orders, but the moral weight of it, spoken in front of dozens of witnesses, created a moment of power that transcended law. James drew his pistol, pointing it directly at Samuel's chest. Step aside, Evelyn. Now. No. I will shoot him where he stands. Then you'll have to shoot me first. Evelyn moved to stand directly in front of Samuel, her arms spread wide. Because I'm not moving. For a long moment, husband and wife stared at each other across the barrel of a gun, the weight of 15 years of marriage and a lifetime of Southern tradition hanging between them. Around them, the workers watched in stunned silence as their world turned upside down. Finally, James lowered the weapon, but the look in his eyes promised that this was far from over. You've made your choice, Evelyn, he said quietly. Now you'll live with the consequences. He turned and walked away, his hired men following. But Evelyn knew he would be back, and when he returned, he would come with the full weight of law and custom behind him. As the torches disappeared into the darkness, Evelyn found herself alone with Samuel and the gathered workers, the magnitude of what she had just done beginning to sink in. Miss Evelyn, Samuel said softly, you don't understand what you've just started. Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I do. Dawn broke grey and ominous over Ashford Plantation, the sky heavy with storm clouds that seemed to mirror the tension hanging over the estate. Evelyn had not slept. Instead, she had spent the night in the main house's library, writing letters by candlelight and making preparations for what she knew would be the most important day of her life. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books and heavy mahogany furniture, had always been her sanctuary. But tonight it felt different, charged with the weight of decisions that would reshape not just her own future, but the futures of everyone on the plantation. The familiar smell of old books and beeswax candles now seemed to carry the scent of change, of endings and new beginnings. The first letter was to her sister in Charleston, explaining everything and asking for help. She wrote carefully, knowing that the letter might be intercepted, but also knowing that she needed allies if she was going to survive what was coming. Her sister Margaret had always been more progressive in her thinking, more sympathetic to the abolitionist cause that was gaining strength in the North. The second letter was to the bank in Savannah, where her father had left her a small inheritance, money that James had never been able to touch because it remained in her maiden name. It wasn't a fortune, but it might be enough to start a new life somewhere far from Georgia, somewhere where the Ashford name carried no weight or influence. The third letter was to a lawyer in Atlanta, whom she had met at a social gathering, a man who had quietly expressed sympathies for the abolitionist cause. She had remembered his words about the growing network of people willing to help escaped slaves, and she hoped he might be willing to help her as well. As she wrote, Evelyn found herself thinking about the 7 children sleeping in the workers' quarters, about the lives they might have if they could escape the plantation. Sarah, the oldest, was clearly intelligent and capable. With an education, she could become anything she wanted. Thomas had shown an aptitude for working with his hands, creating beautiful carvings from scraps of wood. Each child had their own gifts, their own potential that was being wasted in the shadow of slavery. As the sun rose higher, Evelyn heard the sound of horses approaching. Through the library window, she could see James returning with a much larger group of men, not just slave catchers this time, but the local sheriff and several prominent plantation owners from neighboring estates. The sight of them made her stomach clench with fear, but also strengthened her resolve. She recognized Colonel Whitmore from Magnolia Grove, Judge Patterson from Riverside Plantation, and Dr. Morrison, who owned the largest cotton operation in the county. These were the pillars of local society, men whose word carried weight in courtrooms and drawing rooms alike. Their presence here meant that James was calling in every favor, marshalling every resource to crush her rebellion before it could spread. She had crossed a line last night, and there was no going back. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face etched with worry. "Miss Evelyn, they're asking for you, Mr. James and the others." "I know." Evelyn sealed the last letter and handed all three to Martha. "I need you to get these to town immediately. Take the fastest horse and ride to the post office yourself. Don't trust anyone else with them." "Miss Evelyn, what's happening? What are you planning?" "I'm planning to do what should have been done years ago." Evelyn stood smoothing her dress, the same blue silk she had worn 3 days ago when she first saw the children. It seemed fitting somehow. "Where are Samuel and the children?" "Hidden in the root cellar beneath the old smokehouse. But Miss Evelyn, they can't stay there long. If Mr. James searches, he won't have time to search." Evelyn walked toward the door, then paused. "Martha, after today, things are going to change dramatically. I want you to know that whatever happens, you've been more than an employee to me. You've been a friend." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Miss Evelyn, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. We all should be. But sometimes being scared is the only way to find the courage to do what's right." Evelyn walked out onto the front veranda, where James and his assembled group were waiting. In the morning light, they looked like a tribunal, stern-faced men in dark suits and riding clothes, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. The weight of their collective authority was palpable, a reminder of the forces arrayed against anyone who dared to challenge the established order. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the grounds, "to what do I owe this early morning visit?" James stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "Evelyn, these gentlemen are here to witness your public apology and retraction of the wild accusations you made last night." "I see." Evelyn descended the steps slowly, her hand trailing along the railing. "And what accusations were those?" "You know damn well what accusations." James's composure cracked slightly. "You publicly humiliated me in front of the workers, made insane claims about improper conduct on this plantation." "Improper conduct." Evelyn repeated the words thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling it?" Sheriff Morrison, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband has explained the situation. It's clear that the isolation and stress of plantation life have affected your judgment. If you simply apologize and retract your statements, we can all pretend this unfortunate incident never happened." "How generous of you." Evelyn's voice was dry. "And if I refuse?" "Then we'll be forced to consider other options," said Colonel Whitmore from the neighboring Magnolia Grove plantation. "A woman who makes wild accusations against her husband's character, who interferes with the proper discipline of slaves. Well, such behavior suggests an unstable mind." The threat was clear. In 1847, a woman declared mentally unstable by her husband and prominent community members could be committed to an asylum indefinitely. Her property, her freedom, her very identity could be stripped away with the stroke of a pen. Evelyn had heard whispered stories of inconvenient wives who had simply disappeared, locked away in institutions where their protests were dismissed as symptoms of their madness. "I see." Evelyn nodded slowly. "So my choices are to apologize for telling the truth, or be declared insane for refusing to lie." "Evelyn," James said, his voice taking on a tone of false concern, "no one wants to see you hurt. Just say you were mistaken, that the heat and stress confused you, and we can all move on." Move on. Evelyn looked around at the assembled men, these pillars of Southern society, who had come to silence her with threats and intimidation. And Samuel? What happens to him? Samuel will be dealt with appropriately, James said coldly. Meaning? Meaning he'll be sold to a plantation in Mississippi where his talents will be properly utilized. The euphemism made Evelyn's stomach turn. Samuel would be sent somewhere even worse, to endure the same abuse under different masters, while his children remained here as reminders of their father's suffering. And the children? What children? James's voice was sharp. There are no children of any particular significance on this plantation. It was then that Evelyn realized the full scope of what she was fighting against. This wasn't just about Samuel, or even about the specific abuses on Ashford Plantation. This was about an entire system built on the dehumanization of people, a system that these men would protect at any cost because their wealth, their power, their entire way of life depended on it. The morning air was thick with humidity and the promise of rain, but Evelyn felt a strange clarity settling over her. For the first time in her adult life, she could see her situation with perfect honesty, the choices before her, the consequences of each path, the kind of person she would become based on what she did in the next few minutes. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I appreciate you taking the time to visit this morning, but I'm afraid I must decline your generous offer." The silence that followed was deafening. "Evelyn," James said slowly, "you don't understand what you're saying." "On the contrary, I understand perfectly." Evelyn's voice grew stronger with each word. "I understand that you've built your fortune on the systematic abuse of human beings. I understand that you see people as property to be used and discarded at will. And I understand that you're willing to destroy anyone who threatens to expose the truth." "You're making a terrible mistake," Sheriff Morrison warned. "The only mistake I made was remaining silent for so long." Evelyn turned to face James directly. "I will not apologize for telling the truth. I will not retract my statements. And I will not stand by while you destroy Samuel and his children." "Then you've chosen your path," James said quietly. "Sheriff Morrison, I believe my wife is suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She's become delusional, making wild accusations, interfering with plantation operations. I fear for her safety and the safety of others." Sheriff Morrison nodded gravely. "I can see that, Mr. Ashford. Perhaps it would be best if Mrs. Ashford were taken somewhere she can receive proper care." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "I won't be silenced and I won't be hidden away." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded document, one of several copies she had made during her sleepless night. "This is a detailed account of everything I've witnessed and learned about the conditions on this plantation," she announced, holding the paper high. "It includes names, dates, and specific descriptions of the abuse that has taken place here. I've already sent copies to newspapers in Charleston, Savannah, and Atlanta, as well as to several prominent abolitionists in the North." The effect was immediate and dramatic. James went white as a sheet, while several of the other men began talking at once, their voices rising in alarm. The carefully maintained facade of Southern gentility cracked, revealing the panic beneath. "You're bluffing," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Evelyn smiled grimly. "Martha left for town an hour ago with my letters. By this time tomorrow, the story of Ashford Plantation will be front-page news across the South." "You've destroyed us," James whispered. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Evelyn replied. "I've simply refused to be part of the destruction anymore." The sound of running footsteps interrupted the confrontation. One of James's hired men came racing around the side of the house, his face flushed with exertion and anger. "Mr. Ashford," he called out, "the slaves are gone. The ones you wanted. They've disappeared." James spun around. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "The root cellar's empty, sir. Looks like they left during the night. Could be anywhere by now." Evelyn felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. While she had been confronting James and his allies, Samuel had taken the children and fled. They had a head start, and with luck, they might reach the underground railroad stations she had heard whispered about in abolitionist circles. "Find them!" James roared. "Search every inch of this plantation." "James," Evelyn said quietly, "it's over. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with fury and desperation. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is." Evelyn's voice was calm, final. "Because I'm leaving too." The admission stunned everyone into silence. "You can't leave," James said. "You're my wife. This is your home." "This was never my home," Evelyn replied. "It was my prison, but not anymore." She walked past the assembled men, her head held high, and climbed back up the steps to the veranda. At the top, she turned to face them one last time. "Gentlemen, you can declare me insane if you wish. You can try to have me committed. But the truth is already out there, and no amount of intimidation will put it back in the bottle. The world is changing, whether you're ready for it or not." As she disappeared into the house to gather her few personal belongings, Evelyn could hear the men behind her arguing in heated whispers. Some wanted to pursue Samuel and the children immediately. Others wanted to focus on damage control, trying to discredit her letters before they could be published. A few suggested that perhaps it was time to cut their losses and distance themselves from the Ashford family entirely. But Evelyn was no longer listening. She had made her choice, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. An hour later, she emerged from the house carrying a single carpet bag. The men were gone, scattered to deal with the crisis she had created. Only James remained, sitting on the veranda steps with his head in his hands. "Where will you go?" he asked without looking up. "North," she said simply, "to places where people like Samuel and his children can live as human beings instead of property. You'll be ruined. No respectable family will receive you. Then I'll find new definitions of respectability." James finally looked up at her, his face haggard. "I loved you, Evelyn. In my way, I did love you." "I know," she said sadly, "but your way of loving was just another form of ownership, and I'm done being owned." She walked away from Ashford Plantation without looking back, her footsteps echoing on the wooden boards of the veranda, and then fading into silence as she reached the dirt road that led to town. Behind her, the great house stood empty and hollow, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over fields that would soon be worked by free men and women, or not worked at all. The old world was ending, and Evelyn Ashford, no longer a mistress, no longer a wife, but finally truly herself, was walking toward whatever came next. 6 months later, newspapers across the nation would report on the Ashford scandal, one of the first documented cases of a southern plantation mistress publicly exposing the systematic abuses occurring on her own estate. The story would inspire other women to speak out, contribute to the growing abolitionist movement, and serve as evidence in congressional debates about the true nature of slavery. Samuel and his 7 children successfully reached freedom through the Underground Railroad, eventually settling in Canada, where Samuel worked as a carpenter, and his children received educations that had been denied to them in Georgia. They kept the name Ashford, not as a mark of ownership, but as a reminder of the woman who chose courage over comfort. Evelyn herself moved to Boston, where she became a prominent speaker for the abolitionist cause and helped establish schools for freed slaves. She never remarried, but she often said that she had finally learned the difference between love and possession, a lesson that changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. The Ashford Plantation was eventually abandoned, its fields returning to wilderness. But the story of what happened there lived on, a testament to the power of one person's decision to choose truth over silence, justice over comfort, and human dignity over social convention. In her later years, Evelyn would often receive letters from Samuel's children, now grown adults with families of their own. Sarah became a teacher, Thomas a skilled craftsman, Mary a nurse who dedicated her life to helping others. Each had found their own path to success and happiness, but they never forgot the woman who had risked everything to give them a chance at freedom. The ripple effects of that one morning's confrontation continued to spread long after the participants had passed into history. The detailed accounts Evelyn had written became crucial evidence in the growing case against slavery, cited by abolitionists and lawmakers alike as proof of the system's inherent cruelty. Her story inspired other women across the South to question their own complicity in the institution of slavery, leading to a quiet but significant network of resistance that would prove crucial in the years leading up to the Civil War. Some provided safe houses for the Underground Railroad, Others used their social positions to gather intelligence about slave catchers and sympathetic officials. Perhaps most importantly, Evelyn's choice to see Samuel and his children as fully human, worthy of protection, dignity and freedom, challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire system of slavery was built. In choosing to stand with the oppressed rather than the oppressor, she had demonstrated that change was possible, even in the most entrenched and seemingly hopeless situations. The old mill where Evelyn and Samuel had their fateful conversation eventually crumbled into ruins, but local historians would later mark the spot with a simple plaque. Here truth was spoken and courage was found. It became a pilgrimage site for those seeking inspiration to stand up against injustice in their own times, and somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, in a small town where former slaves had built new lives for themselves, 7 children grew up free, living proof that sometimes, when one person chooses to do what's right instead of what's easy, the whole world can change. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of individual courage to change the world, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to stand up for what's right. What would you have done in Evelyn's place? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, the choice between silence and speaking truth is one we all face in ways both large and small every single day. The legacy of Ashford Plantation serves as a reminder that history is not just made by kings and generals, but by individuals who, in moments of moral crisis, choose to act according to their conscience rather than their comfort. Evelyn Ashford's story continues to inspire those who face their own moments of truth, their own choices between complicity and courage, in a world that often seems divided between those who have power and those who suffer under it. Her example reminds us that we all have the capacity to choose which side we're on, and that sometimes that choice can change everything.